Good morning. That's probably almost a little too high. Okay. All right. It's good to be here this morning. We sort of took a break last week from this because Daryl Willis with EEM was with us, and it's always good to hear about what that organization's doing, spreading God's word in other countries, and we appreciate the work that he does with EEM, and we're glad that he came and gave a report to us. We're going to continue this morning with Philippians, the first chapter, and I really want to try to get through some of this material. The first chapter, there's a lot in it, so I don't think we've wasted our time, but I want to get through it. Toward the end of the chapter, it'll move a lot quicker. And then when we get into the second chapter, that's where we're going to really sink our teeth in and get into some very weighty matters in the second chapter. But where we left off last time, as we were studying this, is in the first chapter, down around verse 14 or 15 there, as Paul was talking about that because he was in prison, that had encouraged different ones to go out and preach the gospel. He talks about in verse 14, because of his chains, most of the brothers and sisters have become confident in the Lord and dare all the more to proclaim the gospel without fear. And then he goes on to talk about the fact that there were two different types of people who were doing this. Some of them, he says in verse 15, were preaching Christ out of envy and rivalry. And that's where we left off the last time we were in this class, talking about the fact that the gospel was being preached with some having the motives of envy and rivalry. In verse 17, he says they preach Christ out of selfish ambition. So obviously they were competing with the Apostle Paul in some way, because he makes it clear that they are doing this toward him. The envy, the rivalry, the selfish ambition were the motives for them preaching the gospel, trying to hurt the Apostle Paul. And so we were talking about what it means to have envy, rivalry, or selfish ambition within a congregation. So what are some ways that you can think of that people within a congregation could have envy, rivalry, and selfish ambition? Anybody? Yes, Jerry? Okay. Yes, Jerry says that one person might say, I can preach better than you can. And that's true. That would be in the church universal, more than just one congregation, but that is so true because there are definitely those competitions out there among some. And some people want to try to rise up and be something in a brotherhood, so to speak. Try to have the respect and the adoration of different ones. So Jerry is talking about that's definitely true. Rivalry among preachers, envy among preachers, selfish ambition. What's something else? Yes. Okay, yes. Yeah, in Corinth, especially, there was a struggle of the exercise of spiritual gifts. And today, whatever our talents are, whatever our gifts are that God has given us, there could be those who would strive to struggle with that. In fact, let me go on from there, from what you just said, because that's one of the areas I want to go to. Within a congregation, we're all to be striving to serve one another, right? But sometimes in our service to one another, there are actions that are more visible than others. And it's those visible things that we sometimes think of, or our mind goes to when we say service. When if, if I were not even talking about this subject and I said, think of somebody who serves this congregation, where would your mind first go? Would it go to, preachers, song leaders, men who serve in other capacities or whatever? We generally think that service is being up front of everybody, some public capacity. That's where our mind goes when we think of service. But that's not, all of those things are a service, but that is not the way everybody serves a congregation. And that's why I ended, the last time we were in this class, that's why I ended with talking about elders and deacons. Because we have a tendency, unfortunately, to think that those are positions of some type of honor. And those are not positions of honor. They should not be positions of honor. They should be positions of service and responsibility. Yes, Robin? Absolutely, 100%. If whatever our service is, but especially in those that seem to be more visible, if we're doing it for the reason that says, look at me, look at what I'm doing, that is selfish ambition. That is exactly what Paul would be talking about here. Yes. Yeah, right. If I think I can do it better than somebody else, so let me do it, then that's right. That is, again, saying it's me and what I do, and so let me do it. Look at me. I do it better than somebody else, so look at me. Yes, Gene? Right, right. What Gene was saying, and I won't repeat everything, but he was saying, he compares it to the restaurant industry, which he's worked in for several years. There are people that do all kinds of things behind the scenes, and then those that interact with the public and all. And sometimes people that are behind the scenes don't think they're appreciated for how hard they work because you don't see it, but you see the people interacting with the public. In a congregation, there are a lot of things that are done behind the scenes that people don't see. And then there are the public responsibilities as well. Everyone needs to be doing it for the benefit of each other. If we're doing it for any other reason, then we're wrong. We're not doing it like Christ. Now, I want to briefly say something about elders and deacons, or, shepherds and deacons, and then I want to move on. I had said a while ago, those positions are not positions of honor. That's not why God put them there. To be an elder or a bishop, an overseer or a shepherd within a congregation is a responsibility. It's not an honor. That's why when Paul was giving qualifications to Timothy in 1 Timothy 3, he said, if anyone desires this. Well, if it's just a position of honor, there'd probably be a lot more people desiring it, but that's not what it's about. It's about the responsibility of watching over a flock, making sure that the flock is fed, that they are safe, that they are active. There's a lot of things going on there behind the scenes that a lot of times people don't see, but it is being careful and concerned about that flock. And if you're doing it for any other reason, you don't need to be doing it. The same is true with a deacon. Now, what does the word deacon mean? Servant. Jerry said servant because it comes from, in the New Testament, it comes from a Greek word that means servant. It can be translated, we've transliterated it to come up with the word deacon, but it means servant or minister. It's somebody who's minister. We've taken the word minister and turned it into a position, when really all that's talking about somebody who's serving somebody else. They're ministering to somebody else. But there is, like we talked about at the very beginning of this class, there is a position, and I hate to use that word, but there is a position of responsibility called a deacon. And that's why Paul, at the very beginning of this chapter, first chapter, he writes the letter to the saints or the Christians at Philippi with the overseers and deacons. All right? It's just like in Acts, the first chapter, when Peter and the other Christians were gathered there in Jerusalem waiting for the Holy Spirit and waiting for what was going to happen. And he begins to talk about Judas. And he says what happened to him. He killed himself. And then he stands up and says, it's important that we replace him. And he starts quoting from the Psalms. And one of the verses he quoted was, let another take his position of leadership. Now, an apostle, what does the word apostle mean? Yeah, ambassador, or one sent, one that is sent out. There are times when others in the scriptures are talked about as being apostles, but it's because a congregation sent them or something like that. But then there was a position that they understood of the apostles that needed to be replaced out of those who had been with Jesus from the beginning of his ministry. So the same is true with deacon. It means service, and it is a position of service and ministry. But it also has responsibilities and authority that goes along with those responsibilities. Now, let me ask you this. When you think about people serving the congregation, people that get up in front and serve the congregation, who is it that you automatically think of? Well, okay, but speaking of the individuals, okay, Jeff, the preacher, song leader, people who wait on the table, whatever. These are all men, right? That's where your mind generally goes, isn't it? Oh, well, I start thinking about all these men serving the congregation. I want you to turn with me to Romans, the 16th chapter. Okay. Yeah, yeah. That's good. Gene said when I asked that question, his mind automatically went to individuals like Diane and others, Tony, or there's a whole host of them that we could talk about, because they truly do serve this congregation, and it's not always visible. Those of us that know what's going on see it, but it's not always visible. But I want you to look at Romans 16, verse 1. Paul says, I commend you to our sister Phoebe, a what? A servant, but it's that word diakonos. It's the Greek word that is the same word used in other places. 1 Timothy 3, Philippians 1, where Paul wrote to the elders and the overseers and the deacons. It's the same Greek word. All right? Which means here was somebody who was serving. Serving what? She was serving the congregation. He says, I commend you to our sister Phoebe, a servant of the church at Cenchrea. I ask that you receive her in the Lord. She was serving that congregation in a very visible way. She was serving that congregation. They had sent her on this mission. He said, I ask you to receive her. So she was sent from Cenchrea, which was a southern port of Corinth, and she was sent to the church at Rome. For some reason, some think that it may have been to deliver this letter of Paul. She wasn't the one that wrote it, because down in verse 22, Tertius actually wrote from what Paul was saying. But somebody had to bring the letter there. She came, and Paul's telling the congregation there at Rome, you receive her as a servant of this church. And he says, I ask you to receive her in the Lord in a way worthy of his people, and to give her any help she may need from you, for she has been the benefactor of many people, including me. So what I wanted to show you, the reason I bring that verse up, is because here was a servant of that church that was acting in a public role. And Paul commends her and tells the congregation to accept her. All right? So, what my whole point in all of this is that, going back to Philippians, the first chapter now, anytime we're doing something, we should not be doing it out of envy, rivalry, self-aggrandizement. We should not selfish ambition. We should be doing it because we want to help somebody else. We want to serve somebody else. And don't just think of men in those roles. Think of men and women. Okay? Yes. That's right. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. Paul spoke in 1 Corinthians 13 about love as the motivation for whatever we do. And he didn't just mean, I feel good and all this. It's that agape love. It's that I'm going to sacrifice myself for your benefit. That's the type of love he was talking about. And he goes through the first few verses there and says, I can do all these great things, and if I'm not doing it motivated by love, it's useless. It means nothing. So the love is the same love that we've talked about back in this chapter, where Paul says, I want your love to abound more and more. It was that I'm here to serve you. You're more important than me, so I'm here to serve you. And I'm doing it because that's what I'm here for. That's my motivation is, if I see what you need, then I need to try to take care of that. And that's our reason for doing anything. So you're exactly right, Renee. Yes, Joe? Well, I appreciate that, but if you guys could see, within our eldership, there's 6 men. And if you could see what all those other guys are doing, you need to be thanking them. They do a wonderful job. And our deacons, oh, you just can't say enough about our deacons. This congregation functions. Any organization needs people that are doing the work. This congregation seems to function flawlessly. Well, it's because of all these guys like Spencer and a bunch of, Casey and a bunch of them that are back behind the scenes making sure that all this stuff gets done, and we don't ever see it. We don't see it. Yes, Robin? Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more, Robin. They're not out there trying to do something and say, look at me. They're just getting the work done. You're exactly right. Yes. Okay, I heard something about 4:30 in the morning, and showing love, I couldn't hear everything that you said. I'm getting old. Oh, okay. Thank you for clarifying that. Okay, they were saying that they didn't have a ride to service, but somebody was up at 4:30 this morning trying to help them find a ride so that they could get here, and that is service. That is service. And we may not ever know who did it, but that's not why they're doing it. They did it because they wanted to serve somebody else. So thank you. Okay, so now, as we go on, the Apostle Paul says that there are those people who are doing this for the wrong motives, and he says in verse 17, they're not sincere. They're supposing that they can stir up trouble for me while I am in chains. And it really doesn't matter what the trouble was. Maybe it was that, the government was against somebody preaching another king, Jesus. And so they thought, if we go and preach Christ as king, that'll cause them to, be harder on Paul. Or maybe they wanted to just put down Paul's influence among the brethren and raise themselves up to be more influential among the brethren. Whatever the situation was, it doesn't matter, because what they were doing was trying to harm Paul. And Paul's response to that in verse 18 is, what does it matter? And we would say, I think in my terminology today, I'd say, so what? So what? It doesn't matter. Because he goes on and says, the important thing is that in every way, whether from false motives or true, Christ is preached. And because of this, I rejoice. Christ is preached. That's all that Paul cared about. He didn't care what somebody was doing to him. He didn't care what their motives were, as long as the truth. And that shows us that whoever was doing this preaching, even out of the false motives, was preaching the right thing. They were preaching Christ. And Paul says, I don't care because the false motives isn't changing the message, it's just changing the motivation behind the message. And he didn't care whether somebody was trying to hurt him or not, as long as Christ is preached. This is living Christ. This is exactly what this letter is about, and what we're trying to get a knowledge of and into our minds is everything we do, making sure that we're living Christ, that our motivation is, I just want to show Christ to the world. That's it. And so, you know, think about, okay, the last time somebody insulted you, how'd that make you feel? Yeah, defensive, angry, got your feelings hurt. Why do we feel that way? I'm not saying I'm immune, but why do we feel that way? We have emotions, but what has somebody done? They have done something to me, against me. And that's what Paul's talking about here. These people were doing this against Paul. So it was an insult. It was a damage. They're trying to damage him. And Paul's like, I don't care. So that's the attitude that we should have when we're talking about living for Christ. We're going to see a lot of this in the second chapter, but Paul says, look, we got to think of other people as more important than ourselves. So if somebody insults me, that's not a big deal, because who am I? And that's what Paul's attitude was. And so we've got to think, how would Christ handle this? As Christ went about in his ministry, he didn't sit there and worry about people saying bad things about him, or trying to hurt him, or trying to kill him, or all these things that people were doing out there. Christ didn't care. His whole mission was, I'm here to do the will of my Father. And that's got to be our attitude. When, you know, sometimes we get together and somebody says something and it hits us the wrong way and we kind of get our feelings hurt. Why? Why? Because, oh, you said that against me. That's not living Christ. Yes. Matthew 5. Yeah, Matthew 5. And let me tell you, Jason, you're exactly right, because that is the context of those verses on the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5. He says, if somebody, you know, the slap in the face is like this. You remember the old days you've seen on TV or whatever, where somebody would challenge somebody to a duel? How would they challenge them? Take out a pair of gloves and slap them across the face, right? Because that was an insult. And then, you know, I challenge you to a duel. Well, you're insulted, so now you've got to duel the person. Well, that's what Jesus was basically saying, was an insult should not move you. Turn the other cheek. You haven't done anything as long as I'm showing you Christ. That was the context of that. That's why he said in the same context, in the same verses, if the Roman government asks you to go a mile, you'll go 2. Because it's not about me. Let me give you another, because this one is one that I have really had to work on. And I have tried to train myself to really think about this. When you get in your car, do you get offended if somebody cuts you off? Or maybe you get behind somebody and you think they're going too slow and you go, oh, I wish they'd just get over, or whatever. And I've started trying to actively think, when I get in my car, how would Christ handle these things? How you know, somebody's slowing me down, is that really going to hurt me? Or somebody, cuts me off, what I've tried to start doing, and believe me, I'm not saying I'm perfect, but I have actively started thinking about these things. If I see somebody on the blinker with their blinker on, they want to get over, I just slow down, let them on over. It is aggravating, but I still have to remind myself, you know, what is it when I get in the car? Do I think I'm in a race that I have to be first, you know? If they cut me off, okay, you know, it's okay when I do it because I have a reason for doing it, right? But if the other guy does it to me, hey, you know, no, we've got to start thinking, look, how would Christ handle this? I have actively tried to do that, and I hope I get better and better at that. Yes, Larry? That's right. That's right. That's right. And that's the bottom line. Why do we think we're so important? Paul's going to tell us in this letter, you're not more important than the other guy. You are always to think he's more important than you. It doesn't matter who it is. Yes, Tony? Yeah. Yeah. Submission. Servitude. I submit. And what is submission? I put myself under you to help you, what you need. That's submission. And that's the servitude that we're talking about. And that's what Paul was doing. He was living Christ. And so he says, it doesn't matter, the important thing in every way, whether from false motives or true, Christ is preaching. Because of this, I rejoice. I'm happy that they're out there preaching Christ, and that's all that I care about. And that's what living Christ means. And we apply it in all these ways we just talked about. I'm not more important than you. So yeah, come on over, buddy. You know, I'm not more important than you. All right. Then Paul goes on, and really the end of verse 18 ought to go with verse 19, I think. But Paul says, yes, and I will continue to rejoice because, or for, I know that through your prayers and God's provision of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, what has happened to me will turn out for my deliverance. Now, I want to caution you here, because we got to see it in its context. When we see Paul talking about saying, I know this is going to turn out for my deliverance, the first thing that probably pops into our mind is he's saying, oh, I'll be let out of prison. But that's not the context. Because Paul says, I know that through your prayers and God's provision of the Spirit of Jesus Christ. So there's something there that the Spirit is helping him with. And there's something that their prayers are helping him with. And he says, what has happened to me will turn out for my deliverance. Well, what has happened to him? This whole section on others going out and preaching Christ, what did he start that with up in verse 12? Now, I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that what has happened to me has actually served to advance the gospel. Well, what had happened to him? He's in prison. So down here where Paul says, what has happened to me will turn out for my deliverance, you mean because I'm in prison, I'm going to be let out? No, that doesn't make sense, does it? So what's the deliverance? Okay. Yes. Okay, salvation, and I like that better. What you're saying is true, Gene. Yes, but that's in addition, I think, to the deliverance. We've got, Diane says, salvation. It's true that overall that's going to be true, but every day every day we're faced with decisions, right? As to how we're going to stand on our faith. Am I going to make this decision because it's what God, what Christ wants me to do, or I'm going to make this decision because this is easier and it's what I want to do? Every day. Those are temptations that are placed before us, right? Temptations to submit my will to God or do what I want to do. And what did Jesus even say? Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. The deliverance that he's talking about is deliverance from the temptation to be ashamed of Christ. He doesn't want to be ashamed of Christ. He's in prison for preaching the gospel. He's going to have to give an offense of that when he goes to trial and everything, and he's praying that God will deliver him from losing his faith or being afraid. How do I know that? Because in verse 20 he says, I eagerly expect and hope that I will in no way be ashamed, but will have sufficient courage so that now as always Christ will be exalted in my body, whether by life or by death. So the deliverance he wants, and he feels like as they pray for him and God gives him the Spirit, he will be delivered to have the courage and the strength and the faith to stand up for Christ, no matter what the situation that faces him. And that's why he says, I'll never deny you, Christ. I'd go to prison and to death. And the next minute, what did he do? And Jesus he denied him 3 times. And Jesus even told him, Satan's going to sift you like wheat. You need to pray. So that's what Paul's doing here. He's saying, I eagerly expect that with your prayers and the Spirit, I will not be ashamed, and I will have sufficient courage to, as always, to stand up and let Christ be exalted in my body, whether by life or by death. Now, when he says, Christ exalted in my body, whether by life or death, does he know whether he's going to live or die? No, he doesn't. Now, I'm glad y'all recognize that, because later he's going to talk about he expects that he's going to continue to live and probably even get out of prison, but at this point he doesn't know. He's saying, that's what I expect, that's what I hope, but I don't know whether I'm going to live or die. God hadn't revealed it. And if I have to die, then he says, I pray that I'll have the courage to let Christ be glorified if I have to die, that I will not be ashamed, I will not fear, and that I will stand firm for Christ. And that's the attitude that we've got to have as well. Now, he goes on and he says, after saying, whether he doesn't know whether he's going to live or die, in verse 21, he says, for to me to live is Christ and to die is gain. Now, I want you to think about that. To live is Christ and to die is gain. What did he mean by that? Okay. Okay. Yes. Now, what Jerry has said. Jerry said if he lives, he's going to continue preaching Christ. If he dies, he's better off. That's 100% correct, but I also want you to see further than what that is. He says, I am torn. He says, if I am to go on living in the body, this will mean fruitful labor for me. And what's the fruitful labor? Preaching, yes, that will produce fruit. He preaches, God gives the increase. So he says, if I go on living in the body, I get to preach more. Yet what shall I choose? I do not know. I am torn between two. I desire to depart and be with Christ, which is better by far, but it is more necessary for me that I remain in the body. Now, that almost sounds like Paul saying, I'd rather just go on and be with Christ. But that's not what he says. He says, I am torn between the two, and I don't know which one to choose. Because yes, to go on and be with Christ would be far better than his physical circumstances. But he says to remain is also better for them. He gets to keep on preaching. He gets to share Christ with others and produce fruit that way. And he is not saying, I want this, but what God's probably going to do is this. What he's saying is I have a real hard decision here. Which one do I want more? To be with you and to help you, or to go and be with Christ? This is two strong desires that he's talking about. That's how much he lived Christ, because to live was Christ, was helping others, preaching, serving. And he says, I really want to do that. But I also know that if I went on, I'd be better off physically, or whatever. Yeah, he'd be in a better situation. But he's really desiring both here. So don't think, this is what I really want, but this is what's probably going to happen. He's saying, no, I desire both. To live as Christ, to die as gain. And he says, to depart and be with Christ is far better, but in verse 24, it is more necessary for you that I remain in the body. And then in verse 25, he says, convinced of this, I know that I will remain, and I will continue with all of you for your progress and joy in the faith. So here, knowing how much they need him, then Paul says, it seems like it will be God's will that I remain in the body. And yeah, it is. You're exactly right, Norm. He has a desire to do both. That's why he's torn between the two, because it's like, how can I? I'm a guy who loves sweets. I just love sweets, and I really have to, discipline myself and try not to. The people that went to Baxter know I like cake. So anyway, somebody sits me down at a meal and says, here's a piece of cake and here's a coconut pie. Man, I am torn between the two, because I have a strong desire for both. That was Paul's dilemma. He had a strong desire for both, and he doesn't really, God hadn't revealed, he doesn't really know which way God's going to do it. But because he feels like it's more necessary for the brethren and for the preaching of Christ for him to remain in the body, then he's convinced that's what's probably going to happen. And that's why he says, convinced this, I know that I will remain and I will continue with all of you for your progress and joy in the faith. Yeah, you're saying this, so I'm trying to process it, but I can see what you're saying. Norma said it'd be like if you had an adult child that was this close to obeying the gospel, you wouldn't want to leave that situation. And in a sense, that is what Paul's saying. The more I live and the more I preach, there will be fruit from that. And that's what he really desires. But he also desires for the progress and joy of the brethren. And the progress that he's talking about here, what did we start this first chapter in talking about? Look up there in verse 6. he says, I'm being confident of this, that he who began a good work in you will carry it on to completion until the day of Christ Jesus. Carrying that work that God began in them on to completion, that's the progress. Being more like Christ. That's the work that God began in us when we were receptive to the gospel, called by the gospel and receptive to it, is progressing to become more like Christ. And Paul says, I want to work with you to further that along. And when that is happening, it ought to produce joy. You know, if I lose joy for something, I'm not going to progress in it much. But when I really love something and I'm happy doing it, you know, Dick, let me ask you this. When you go out and you play a really great round of golf, do you ever want to get back on the golf course again? Oh, you can't wait till that next time, huh? I mean, when you play a really good round, you can't wait to get, because it brought you some joy and you're thinking, man, I want to do it again. Well, if it's like me, I don't play much golf anymore, but back when I did, I'd play a really good round, and then the next time I would not play a good round. So yeah, it's frustrating, and I finally came to the conclusion, why should I pay to torture myself? So anyway, yeah. So anyway, that's all the time that we have, but I want to leave you with that this whole book is going to be about us learning to think, how do we live like Christ? All right, thank you. Yeah, that's right. In the end, he did, that's right.